There is a specific kind of silence that only exists above the tree line in the Brooks Range. It isn't just the absence of noise. It is a physical weight, a heavy suffocating blanket of pressure that presses against your eardrums and settles deep into the marrow of your bones. Down in the cities, or even in the small frontier towns that dot the Dalton Highway, silence is just a pause between sounds. It is the gap between the hum of a refrigerator and the passing of a distant truck. Here, atop Fire Watchtower 4. Silence is the default state of the universe. It is ancient, patient, and entirely indifferent to whether you live or die. I have been manning Tower 4 for 6 seasons now. Most guys don't last more than 2. They come up here with romantic notions of writing a novel, or finding themselves in the wilderness, only to realize that the wilderness doesn't want to be found. It wants to strip you bare. They crack under the isolation, usually around the 3rd week when the novelty of the view wears off and the reality of the solitude sets in. But I'm not like them. I didn't come up here to find myself. I came up here to forget. The world down there is loud, messy, and full of complications I no longer have the energy to navigate. Up here, life is simple. You watch the horizon. You report the smoke. You survive. Or at least, that was the routine until the snow started. It began on a Tuesday in late September, which wasn't unusual for this latitude. The sky had turned the color of a bruised plum, a deep, swirling purple that spoke of violence waiting to be unleashed. I radioed it into Elias at the base station, 70 miles to the south. Looks like a heavy front moving in from the Arctic, I had said. Watching the barometer on the wall plummet, like a stone drop down a well. Might want to hold off on that supply drop until it passes. Copy that, Finn. Elias' voice crackled back, warm and distorted by the distance. Batten down the hatches, meteorology says it's a big one, but it should blow over in 48 hours. Don't let the stove go out. I signed off and poured myself another cup of black coffee, feeling the heat of the ceramic mug seep into my cold fingers. I wasn't worried. I had weathered blizzards up here before. In fact, I enjoyed them. There is a primal comfort in being inside a sturdy structure while nature rages outside, a feeling of defiance against the elements. I checked the propane levels, restocked the wood for the backup stove, and settled into the armchair by the west-facing window to watch the show. But this wasn't the show. It was an erasure. The first flakes were the size of quarters, heavy and wet, slapping against the reinforced glass of the cupola. Within an hour, the visibility had dropped to 0. The majestic peaks of the Endicott Mountains, usually the sentinels of my existence, were swallowed whole by a churning wall of white. The wind picked up, screaming around the metal struts of the tower with a voice that sounded disturbingly like a human shriek. It rattled the floorboards beneath my boots and made the entire structure sway gently, a sickening, rhythmic lurch that you never quite get used to. 48 hours came and went, but the storm didn't break. If anything, it intensified. By day 4, the snow wasn't falling, it was driving horizontally, a relentless assault of ice crystals that scoured the paint from the railings outside. The windows were caked in rime ice, turning the view into a milky, translucent blur. I was effectively blind. The world had shrunk to the 20 by 20 foot square of the cabin. I spent my time reading dog-eared paperbacks I had read a dozen times before, playing solitaire until the cards felt greasy in my hands, and pacing the perimeter of the room like a caged animal. It was the routine that kept me sane, but even that began to fray around the edges. I would wake up, scrape a peephole in the frost on the glass, and see nothing but white. I would radio Elias, and we would exchange the same tired pleasantries. Still coming down up there. Yeah, Elias. Can't see my own hand if I stick it out the door. Hang tight, Finn. Radar shows the low pressure system is stalling. Just a freak occurrence. I tell clear up. A freak occurrence. That's what we called it on day 5. By day 9, we stopped calling it anything. We just stopped talking about it. The psychological toll of a whiteout is hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived through it. It's a form of sensory deprivation, with no horizon, no shadows, and no variation in color. Your depth perception fails. Your circadian rhythms drift. I found myself sleeping for 12 hours at a stretch, waking up groggy and disoriented. unable to tell if it was 8 a.m. or 8 p.m. without looking at my watch. The gray light filtering through the ice was constant, unchanging. A perpetual twilight that offered no warmth and no comfort. On the 11th day, the heater began to sputter. I had plenty of propane in the main tank at the base of the tower, but the line feeding the cabin had likely frozen or clogged. I had to go out. Suiting up took 20 minutes. Thermal layers, wool, Gore-Tex, heavy boots, goggles, face mask. I looked like an astronaut preparing for a spacewalk. When I unlatched the heavy steel door, the wind hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. The cold was shocking, instantly numbing any exposed skin. It wasn't just cold, it was an aggressive, predatory freeze that sought to suck the heat from your core the moment you stepped out of the sanctuary. I clipped my safety line to the railing, a rule I never broke, and stepped out onto the catwalk. The metal grating was buried under 3 feet of drift. I had to kick and shovel my way to the ladder, the wind threatening to peel me off the side of the tower with every step. Descending the ladder was a nightmare. The rungs were slick with ice, and the wind buffeted me so hard, my boots kept slipping. I couldn't see the ground. I couldn't see the sky. I was suspended in a void of swirling white, a chaotic nothingness that felt like the end of the world. I made it to the propane tank, my fingers clumsy and useless inside my thick mittens. I managed to clear the valve and get the gas flowing again, but as I turned to climb back up, I paused. In the roar of the wind, amidst the screaming gale, I thought I heard something. It wasn't the wind. It was deeper, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated in my chest, rather than my ears. It sounded like heavy machinery, vast and grinding, moving somewhere out in the tundra. I froze, straining to hear over the blood rushing in my ears. Bears were hibernating. There were no logging operations within 200 miles. No roads, no machines. The sound faded, swallowed by a fresh gust that nearly knocked me to my knees. I shook my head, blaming the isolation and the sensory deprivation. My mind was filling in the blanks, creating patterns in the noise because it couldn't handle the emptiness. I climbed back up the tower, my muscles burning, and threw myself back inside the cabin. Locking the door behind me with trembling hands, I stripped off my gear and huddled by the heater as it roared back to life, the blue flame mesmerizing. I tried to read, but the words swam on the page. That sound, it had felt so real, so purposeful. By day 14, the food supplies were getting low. I wasn't starving, I had plenty of rice and dried beans, but the fresh stuff was long gone, and the coffee was running out. That was the real crisis. But more than the hunger, it was the feeling of being forgotten that gnawed at me. Elias was checking in less frequently. The static on the radio was getting worse, the interference growing thicker each day. Base to 4 copy. I copy Elias barely. The storm is interfering with the signal. Says clearing tomorrow, hold Finn. Elias. Repeat, Elias. Static. Just a wall of white noise that matched the wall of white snow outside. I spent that night sitting by the radio, turning the squelch knob back and forth, trying to find a human voice in the chaos. I found nothing, just the hiss of the atmosphere, the sound of the planet breathing. I eventually fell into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of being buried alive, of dirt filling my mouth and nose while I tried to scream. I woke up gasping, sweat cooling rapidly on my skin in the drafty cabin. The silence had returned. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The wind had stopped. The screaming of the metal struts had ceased. The tower was perfectly, impossibly still. I scrambled out of my cot and ran to the window. I used my fingernails to scrape away the thick layer of frost, my breath hitching in my throat. I expected to see the sun. I expected to see the blinding brilliance of fresh snow under a blue Alaskan sky, the reward for surviving the 2-week siege. I cleared a patch of glass the size of a dinner plate and looked out. The snow had stopped falling. The storm was over. The air was crystal clear, the visibility perfect for miles. But the sun wasn't there. I looked at my watch. 10 a.m. In the Arctic, even in late autumn, the sun should be low on the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the valleys. But there was no sun. There was no blue sky. The world outside was bathed in a flat, dead gray. It wasn't the gray of cloud cover. The sky above was empty of clouds. It was a deep bruised charcoal, darkening to absolute black at the zenith. It looked like twilight, that fleeting moment just before true night sets in, but it was frozen in time. The mountains were black silhouettes against the dark gray canvas. The miles of fresh snow didn't sparkle. They absorbed the gloom, looking like ash. I stood there for a long time, my hand pressed against the freezing glass, waiting for the light to change. Waiting for the sunrise that my watch said should have happened 4 hours ago. But the sky remained dark, and in that impossible, silent twilight, the true fear finally set in. The storm hadn't just buried the world. It felt like it had severed it. I must have checked my watch 50 times in the first hour. It was a Hamilton Cockeyfield, a mechanical watch my father had given me when I first took the job. It didn't run on batteries. It ran on the movement of my wrist and the winding of a spring. It was immune to cold, immune to electrical failure, and immune to the glitches of the modern world. It ticked with a steady, reassuring rhythm against my pulse. 10:15 a.m., 10:22 a.m., 10:48 a.m. The hands moved. The second hand swept around the face with methodical precision. Time was passing inside the cabin, but outside, time had stopped. I paced the small square footage of the tower, my boots thudding heavily on the wood. Denial is a powerful drug. My brain was running through a Rolodex of rationalizations, frantically trying to categorize this phenomenon into something I had learned in training. Eclipse. Number, a total solar eclipse lasts 7 minutes. Tops. And even then you can see the corona, the ring of fire. This was uniform flat. Volcanic ash. I stopped at the north window, squinting at the horizon. If a supervolcano had gone off in the Aleutians or Kamchatka, the ash cloud could block out the sun. It had happened in history, the year without a summer, but ash falls. It coats the world in grit. The air out there was impossibly clear. I could see the sharp, jagged edges of Anaktuvuk past 40 miles away. There was no haze, no particulate matter drifting down. Just that endless, suffocating clarity. I went to the radio. It was a Motorola base station, bolted to the desk, heavy and industrial. I grabbed the mic, my hands sweating despite the chill in the room. Base, this is 4, do you copy? I released the button. Usually, to raise a squelch sound, a break in the static that tells you the repeater towers are picking up your transmission. This time, there was nothing. The speaker didn't even hiss. It was as if the radio wasn't just receiving no signal, but as if there was no atmosphere to carry one. I checked the power supply. The green light on the inverter was steady. The solar batteries were low after 2 weeks of storm, but they still had juice. The connections were tight. Elias, this is Finn. I have visual anomalies at my location. The storm was broken, but I have 0 sunlight. Repeat, 0 sunlight. Are you reading me? I waited. 1 minute 2. I turned the volume knob all the way up. I pressed my ear against the plastic grill of the speaker. Silence. Not the silence of an empty channel. It was a dead silence. The kind of silence you hear when you unplug a device from the wall. The repeater towers on the ridgeline must have iced over or been blown down by the gale. That had to be it. I was cut off, okay, I whispered to the empty room. My voice sounded too loud, too jagged. Okay, comms are down. Sunday is blocked. You're fine. Keep the routine. But the routine depended on the cycle of day and night, and the cycle was broken. By 1 p.m., the light hadn't changed by a single lumen. It remained that bruised slate gray twilight. It was bright enough to see the furniture in the cabin without a lamp, but dark enough that the corners of the room were pooled in shadow. It was the kind of light that makes you squint, straining your eyes to resolve details that aren't quite there. I decided I needed to get a better look at the sky. The windows were still partially rimed with ice around the edges, distorting the view upwards. I needed to go out onto the catwalk again. I didn't want to. A deep reptilian part of my brain was screaming at me to stay inside, to lock the door and draw the curtains. But I was a fire lookout. My job was to observe. I put the gear back on. The process felt heavier this time. The silence outside seemed to press against the door even before I opened it. When I finally threw the latch and stepped out, the lack of wind was more disorienting than the storm had been. For 14 days, the wind had been a physical presence, a bully shoving me around. Now, the air was still, perfectly, terrifyingly still. The flag on the pole hung limp and frozen, a stiff rectangle of red fabric. I walked to the railing, the snow crunching loudly under my boots. I gripped the cold steel and looked up. The sky wasn't gray from inside. Through the thick glass and the frost, it had looked like a heavy overcast. But out here, with nothing between me and the heavens, I saw the truth. The sky was a matte, featureless void. It wasn't black like the night sky. Night has depth. It has the Milky Way, the auroras, the comfort of distant stars. This was a solid, unyielding canopy of dark violet gray that seemed to hang just above the mountain peaks. It looked like the ceiling of a cave. I scanned for the sun. Nothing. I scanned for the moon. Nothing. Where are the stars? I whispered. The steam from my breath hung in the air in front of my face, refusing to dissipate. If it was day, I should see the sun or clouds. If it was night, if somehow I had lost 12 hours of time, I should see stars. The Arctic sky in winter is a light show of millions of pinpricks, but there was not a single point of light in the entire hemisphere, just that smooth, oppressive darkness. It felt like the lid of a coffin had been slid into place over the world. I looked down at the landscape. The Brooks Range, usually a breathtaking vista of white peaks and green valleys, looked like a monochrome photograph. Without the direct light of the sun, there were no highlights, no sparkles on the snow. Everything was flat. The trees were black scratches on white paper. The valleys were pools of ink, and it was cold. A dry, static cold that made the hairs in my nose freeze instantly. The thermometer on the railing read 40 below zero. That was cold even for here, but without the wind it felt manageable, deceptive. It was a quiet cold that would kill you without you even realizing you were dying. I stood there for 20 minutes, shivering not from the temperature, but from the wrongness of it all. I searched for movement, a caribou, a wolf, a raven. Usually after a storm breaks, life explodes back onto the tundra. Animals emerge to forage, but the landscape was devoid of life. No birds in the sky, no tracks in the snow below. It was as if the world had held its breath and died while I was reading paperbacks and drinking coffee. I retreated inside, the sound of the heavy steel door slamming shut echoing like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. I locked it. Then I engaged the deadbolt. Then I dragged the heavy wooden chair over and wedged it under the handle. I felt foolish doing it. What was I trying to keep out? The dark. I sat in the armchair and watched the clock. 3 p.m., 4 p.m., 6 p.m. The light outside never wavered. The shadows in the room never moved. In a normal day, the sun moves across the sky, shifting the angles of light, painting the room in different hues: morning blue, noon white, evening gold. Now, the light was stagnant. The shadow of the window frame lay across the floorboards in the exact same position it had been in at 10 a.m. Time had divorced itself from light. I tried to eat, opening a can of peaches. They tasted like tin. I tried to read, but I found myself reading the same paragraph over and over again. My eyes kept darting to the window. Is it getting darker? I couldn't tell. The human eye adapts. Was the pupil dilating to let in more of the gloom, or was the gloom deepening? I grabbed a notebook and a pen. I needed to document this. If someone came, or if they found this place later. Day 15, I wrote. My handwriting was jagged. Storm ceased. No sunrise. Skies clear but opaque. No celestial bodies visible. Comms dead. Temperature 40 F. No wind. Silence absolute. I looked at the words. They looked like the ramblings of a madman. A fire lookout who cracked after 2 weeks of isolation. Maybe that was it. Maybe I was still asleep. Maybe the heater had malfunctioned, and I was suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning. I checked the code detector. The green light blinked steadily. No gas. I checked the oxygen levels. Normal. I wasn't crazy. I was awake, and the world was broken. At 9 p.m., according to my watch, I decided to force a night. I closed the heavy blackout curtains I had installed for the summer months, when the sun never set. I lit a kerosene lamp, the warm yellow glow pushing back the gray gloom of the cabin. It felt safer. The artificial light created shadows that flickered and danced, shadows that moved. Movement meant life. I sat by the radio again, turning the squelch knob. Hiss, pop, hiss. Anyone, I whispered into the mic. Any station. This is Firewatch 4. I am declaring a code block situation. Total environmental anomaly. Is anyone out there? I let go of the button, and then, for the first time in hours, the silence changed. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a signal. It was a click. A distinct, sharp click from the radio speaker, like someone keying a mic, but not speaking. I froze. The hair on my arm standing up. Bass, Elias. Click. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Click, click, click. I grabbed a pencil. Morse code. No, the spacing was wrong. It wasn't dots and dashes. It sounded more like something tapping against the glass of a microphone. Or a claw tapping against metal. Who is this? I demanded, my voice rising to a shout. The static swelled, rising in volume like a wave crashing on a shore, and then, buried deep within the white noise, beneath the interference in the distance, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It sounded like a breath, a long, wet, rattling inhalation that went on for too long to be human. Then the radio cut out completely. The power light on the unit stayed on, but the speaker went dead. I sat there in the flickering light of the kerosene lamp, the silence of the high Arctic pressing in on all sides. I looked at the curtains covering the window. Behind them, the gray, starless void was waiting. And for the first time, I realized that the darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a presence, and it knew I was listening. Time is a construct we build out of light and shadow. We measure our lives in sunrises and sunsets, in the lengthening of shadows in the afternoon and the creeping blue of dawn. Take away the sun, take away the stars, and time collapses. It folds in on itself like a dying star, becoming a heavy, dense point of singularity that sits in the center of your chest and refuses to move. I stopped trusting the Hamilton watch on day 18. Or maybe it was day 19. The hands kept moving. The little springs kept winding, but the numbers had lost their meaning. What does 2 p.m. mean in a world where the light is a stagnant, bruised purple that never brightens and never fades? The watch said afternoon. My body screamed that it had been night for 1,000 years. The routine I had clung to the coffee, the logs, the observations disintegrated. I stopped making the bed. I stopped shaving. I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the oven door and saw a stranger staring back. Eyes hollow and rimmed with red. A beard matted with sweat and fear. Skin the color of old parchment. I looked like a ghost haunting my own life. Hunger became a dull, constant ache. I was rationing the rice now. Half a cup a day. The propane was holding, but I had turned the thermostat down to 50 degrees to conserve it. The cabin was permanently cold. I wore all my layers, sleeping in my parka, waking up shivering with ice crystals in my beard from my own breath. But the cold wasn't the worst part. It was the gray. That's what I called it now. The gray wasn't just outside, it was seeping inside. It felt like the air in the cabin was thickening, becoming viscous. Sound didn't travel right. If I dropped a spoon, the clang was deadened, swallowed instantly. If I spoke aloud, my voice sounded flat, as if I were speaking inside a padded cell. I spent hours staring at the radio. The Motorola sat on the desk like a dead idol, a plastic and metal god that had forsaken me. That breathing sound, the wet, rattling inhalation I had heard days ago, hadn't repeated. But I knew it hadn't been a dream. I knew it because every time I looked at the radio, I felt a prickle of electricity at the base of my skull. A lizard brain warning that I was standing too close to a predator. On the 20th day, according to the lying watch, I snapped. The silence broke me. I couldn't take the oppressive quiet any longer. I needed to hear a voice, even a garbled, broken transmission. Even static, I needed to know that the laws of physics still applied. That radio waves were still bouncing off the ionosphere. That humanity hadn't simply been extinguished like a candle flame. I dragged the heavy toolbox from under the cot. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the screwdriver twice. "Fix it," I muttered, my voice cracking. "Just fix the signal gain. It needs more gain." I wasn't a radio engineer, but I knew the basics. The tower had an external antenna, but the storm might have damaged the connection. Or maybe the atmosphere in this. This twilight was too thick for standard frequencies. I needed to boost the reception. I needed to turn this receiver into a dragnet that would catch anything swimming in the ether. I unscrewed the back panel of the Motorola. The smell of ozone and hot dust drifted out a smell of the old world. I bypassed the safety limiter on the squelch. I stripped the insulation off a spare lamp cord and jury-rigged an extension to the internal antenna coil, running the copper wire up the wall and taping it directly to the glass of the cupola. High up, pointing toward the unseen south, it was a desperate, amateurish modification. In a normal world, it might have just blown the fuse. But this wasn't the normal world. I sat back down at the desk, the room lit only by the sputtering blue flame of the stove and the dim, sickly gray light filtering through the window. I put the headphones on. They felt cold against my ears. I turned the power on. The green light flickered, then steadied. I turned the volume knob, slowly hiss, static. But it wasn't the clean white noise of an empty channel. It was thick, heavy. It sounded like gravel pouring down a metal chute. It sounded like the ocean churning during a hurricane. It was violent static. "Is anyone there?" I whispered into the mic. "Mayday. Mayday. This is Tower 4. Does anyone copy?" The static surged, loud and angry, stinging my ears. I winced, but didn't take the headphones off. I turned the frequency dial, scanning the bands. Police scanner. Emergency broadcast. Aviation. Military. Nothing but that churning, gravelly roar. I kept turning, down into the low frequencies, the AM bands. The places where signals go to die, bouncing endlessly between the earth and the sky. And then, I found the hole in the noise. It wasn't a clear channel. It was a dip in the static, a sudden drop in the violent roar that sounded like I had tuned into a vacuum. The gravel noise faded to a low, rhythmic thrumming. Thump, 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 thump. It sounded like a heartbeat, a massive, slow heartbeat, echoing through a fluid medium. My hand froze on the dial. I held my breath, afraid that the sound of my own lungs would drown it out. "Hello?" I breathed SSS. A sibilant hiss cut through the heartbeat. It wasn't interference. It had cadence. It had syntax. SSS. Fuff. I pressed the headphones tighter against my skull until my ears hurt. I closed my eyes, focusing every ounce of my being on that sound. Theon. I jerked back in the chair, nearly ripping the headphones cord out of the jack. My name, it had said my name. Number no, that was impossible. Paridolia. My brain was finding patterns in the chaos. It was the wind. It was the electronics settling. I forced myself to lean back in to listen. Fiend. It wasn't a human voice. It didn't have the timbre of vocal cords vibrating against air. It sounded like dry leaves scraping over concrete. It sounded like many small voices layered on top of each other to mimic a large one. It was wet, and dry, and raspy all at once. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mix of terror and rage. "What do you want?" The heartbeat sound sped up. Thump, 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 thump. And then the whisper changed. It didn't come through the headphones as a sound wave. It felt like it was originating inside the ear cups, bypassing the speaker drivers and drilling directly into the auditory nerve. Ooben. The word was drawn out. A long slithering vowel. Do. I tore the headphones off and threw them onto the desk. They clattered loudly, the sound shocking in the quiet cabin. I scrambled backward, my chair tipping over, sending me sprawling onto the floorboards. I crab-walked backward until my back hit the base of the wood stove. I stared at the headphones. They were sitting on the desk, face up, and I could still hear it faintly, tinny. Coming from the tiny speakers in the ear cups lying 3 feet away. Cold. So. Cold. Open. It wasn't a transmission. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. A radio transmission comes from a source, travels miles, and is picked up by the antenna. But the antenna, I looked up. The copper wire I had taped to the window, the wire wasn't vibrating. The radio wasn't receiving a signal from base. It was acting as a microphone. The signal was strong because the source wasn't 70 miles away. It wasn't even a mile away. The interference, the heartbeat, the whisper. It was being induced directly into the wire by proximity. Something was right outside the glass. I slowly turned my head toward the window where I had taped the wire. The gray twilight pressed against the pane, opaque and flat. I couldn't see anything. Just the frost, the reflection of the stove's blue flame, and the wire. But as I watched, paralyzed by a fear so primal it made my bladder ache, I saw the wire move. It wasn't the wind. The cabin was sealed. The wire taped to the inside of the glass twitched. It vibrated. Something on the outside was tracing the path of the wire with a finger, or a claw. Or something else. A dark shape, darker than the twilight, blocked out the bottom corner of the window. It was dense, light-absorbing. It moved slowly, sliding up the glass, following the copper line I had laid out. The whisper from the headphones on the desk grew louder, rising to a shriek of static. See, you. I scrambled for the breaker box on the wall and slammed my fist into the master switch for the radio. The unit died instantly. The green light faded, the static cut out. The cabin fell silent again, but the shape at the window remained. A shadow within the shadow, a blotting out of the gray. I stopped breathing. I sat there on the floor, my hand gripping the cold iron leg of the stove, and watched the window. The shape lingered for a heartbeat, a long agonizing 10 seconds, and then, with fluid, impossible smoothness, it slid away to the right, vanishing beyond the frame of the window. I didn't move for an hour. I just sat there staring at the glass, waiting for it to shatter, waiting for the door to buckle, but nothing happened. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. But it was different now. Before, the silence had been empty now. The silence was full. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of a predator crouching in the tall grass. I wasn't alone in the gray. I never had been. And it wanted me to open the door. Fear is usually a sharp, hot thing. It's the spike of adrenaline when a bear charges, or the sudden jolt when you lose your footing on a patch of ice. But the fear that settled over me in the hours after the radio died was different. It was cold. It was a heavy fluid sluggishness that filled my veins like mercury. It didn't make me want to run. It made me want to curl up into a ball and simply cease to exist. I sat with my back against the stove for what felt like an eternity, the rifle cradled across my lap. It was a Marlin .4570, a heavy lever action designed to stop a charging grizzly in its tracks. Against a bear, it was a cannon. Against whatever had whispered my name through a dead radio, it felt like a toy. The cabin was silent. The wire I had taped to the window hung limp, an accusatory line of copper against the gray glass. Every few minutes, my eyes would dart to the window, expecting to see that shadow return, to see a face press against the rime ice. But there was nothing, just the endless, flat twilight. By the time my watch read 4 a.m., though the sky remained the same slate gray, it had been. For days a new feeling began to override the fear, claustrophobia. The tower, which had been my sanctuary, had transformed into a trap. I was a sardine in a tin can, waiting for the lid to be peeled back. The air inside tasted stale, recycled, and thick with the smell of my own Terrasour sweat and unwashed clothes. I needed to know. The not knowing was eating me alive. If there was something out there, I needed to see proof. I needed to see tracks. I needed to verify that the laws of physics still applied to the ground below. I stood up, my joints popping in the quiet room. I checked the action on the rifle, sliding around into the chamber. The metallic clack-clack was loud, aggressive. It gave me a momentary surge of false confidence. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, recon, just recon." I suited up again. The process was mechanical, almost ritualistic, distracting me from the trembling of my hands. Base layer, mid layer, parka, face mask, goggles. I strapped the flare gun to my belt, checked the holster, and grabbed the heavy-duty mag light. Even though the twilight made it redundant, when I unlocked the door, The latch felt frozen, stiff. I had to shoulder it open. I stepped out onto the catwalk. The silence hit me first. Inside, there was the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the watch, the sound of my own breath outside. There was zero auditory input. No wind. No birdsong. No distant rumble of tectonic shifting. It was a vacuum of sound. I walked to the railing, my boots crunching on the snow that had drifted onto the grating. The sound was explosively loud, traveling for miles in the dead air. I winced, stopping mid-step, waiting for a reaction. Nothing. I circled the catwalk to the window where the wire was taped. I leaned over the railing, inspecting the glass from the outside. There were marks. They weren't scratches. They were streaks in the ice, long parallel lines where the frost had been melted away. Not by heat, but by friction. It looked like someone had dragged a greased leather glove across the pane. There was a residue, a faint, oily sheen that caught the flat gray light. It didn't look like animal grease. It looked iridescent, like gasoline on water, shimmering with colors that didn't belong in nature's sickly purples and neon greens. I touched it with my gloved finger. It was viscous, slimy. I pulled my hand back, wiping the glove on my parka. My heart hammered against my ribs. Something had been here. It had been right here, inches from my face, separated only by a pane of glass. I looked down. The ladder descended 40 feet to the ground. Usually, looking down gives me a sense of vertigo, a thrill of height. Today, looking down felt like looking into a deep, stagnant pond. The ground was buried under 4 feet of fresh snow, a pristine, white blanket that smoothed out the jagged rocks and scrub brush of the tundra. And there, at the base of the tower, the perfection was broken. From this height, they looked like craters, deep, dark pits in the snow. I gripped the rifle tighter. I had to go down. I had to see them up close. The descent was agonizing. Every rung of the ladder was a gamble. My boots were slick, and my gloves struggled to grip the ice-coated metal. I kept my eyes scanning the perimeter. The rifle slung over my shoulder, banging against my back. The forest line was 100 yards away, a wall of black spruce trees that looked like jagged teeth biting into the gray sky. When my boots finally hit the snow at the base, I sank up to my thighs. The snow was powdery dry. I waded toward the markings I had seen from above. Up close, they didn't make sense. I've been tracking animals since I was 12. I know what a moose track looks like, post-holing through deep powder. I know the gait of a wolf pack, the waddle of a porcupine, the devastating sweep of a grizzly. These were none of those. The prints were massive, elongated, nearly 3 feet in length and narrow, like the imprint of a stilt or a pillar. But they weren't uniform. At the heel of the print, the snow was compressed into hard ice, indicating immense weight. At the toe, the snow was splayed outward, as if something had pushed off with explosive force. But it was the spacing that made my stomach turn. The stride was 12 feet. Nothing walks with a 12-foot stride. Not a moose, not a bear standing on hind legs, and there were only 2 of them at the base of the ladder. I looked around, confused. Where did they come from? I backtracked the trail. It led from the tree line, straight as an arrow, no meandering, no hesitation. Whatever had made these tracks had walked out of the forest, crossed the open tundra with purposeful, terrifying speed, and stopped right here. Right at the base of the ladder. I looked up at the tower. The tracks stopped at the ladder. There were no tracks leading away from the ladder. My breath hitched. Did it climb up? I looked at the metal rungs. There was no mud, no snow disturbingly packed onto the steel, but that oily residue. I squinted. Yes, on the 3rd rung up. And the 10th smears of that iridescent slime. It had climbed up. It had looked in my window. But where did it go? I scanned the snow around the base again. If it climbed up, it had to climb down, or jump. I circled the tower, wading through the drifts, sweating inside my parka, despite the 40 below chill. Where are you? I whispered. Then I found them, on the south side of the tower, about 20 feet away from the base. The tracks resumed, but they were different now. The impact crater where it had landed or dropped was massive. A 5-foot divot that had exposed the frozen permafrost beneath the snow. From there, the tracks changed gait. They weren't the long stilt-like strides anymore. They were drag marks. A wide, deep trough had been carved into the snow, about 4 feet across, flanked by strange rhythmic punctures on either side, like a centipede, or like a man dragging a heavy load, crawling on his belly, digging his fingers in to pull himself forward. But the scale was all wrong. The trough was too smooth. I followed them. I shouldn't have. Every instinct I had as a survivalist screamed at me to climb back up the tower and weld the door shut. But curiosity is a disease, and I was infected. I walked alongside the trail, the rifle raised, the safety off. The silence was so profound that the swishing of my waterproof pants sounded like sandpaper on bone. The trail led away from the tower, heading south-southeast, toward the valley. Toward the deep woods, I walked for maybe 200 yards. The twilight made distances deceptive. The trees didn't seem to get any closer. The gray sky pressed down, heavy and suffocating. I stopped at a small ridge, where the wind had scoured the snow down to a hard crust. The drag marks continued over the ridge, disappearing into a dip in the landscape before rising again toward the tree line. But on the ridge, the snow was thin enough to see details. I knelt down, shining the maglite onto the edge of the trough. Even though the ambient light was sufficient, I wanted to see the texture, in the compressed snow on the side of the drag mark. There was an impression, clear, sharp. It was a handprint. I stared at it, my brain trying to reject the data. It was a handprint. Yes, it had a palm. It had fingers. But there were 7 fingers, and they were too long. Too many joints. The fingers looked like broken twigs pressed into the snow, and the size. The handprint was the size of a snowshoe. I stood up, backing away, my boots slipping on the crust. "No," I said aloud. "No, no, no." I looked ahead, following the trail with my eyes. It went straight into the darkest part of the forest, a cluster of ancient black spruce that grew so thick the light couldn't penetrate. And then I saw it. Or I thought I saw it, in the distance, right at the edge of the trees where the drag marks vanished. Something was standing. It wasn't a creature. It was too small. It looked like a person. A figure standing perfectly still, wearing a bright yellow parka. My heart leaped into my throat. A rescue worker, someone from the base. "Hey," I shouted, the word ripping out of my throat, raw and desperate. "Hey, over here." I waved my arms. The figure didn't move. It didn't wave back. It just stood there, facing me. A splash of unnatural color against the monochrome world. I took a step forward. "Im the lookout. Im Firewatch 4," and then the figure collapsed. It didn't fall like a person fainting, it crumpled, like empty clothes dropping to the floor. The yellow parka just deflated. Sinking into the snow, I froze. I raised the rifle scope to my eye, my hand shaking so bad I could barely find the target. I dialed in the focus. The yellow parka lay in a heap on the snow. It was a standard issue DNR coat, Department of Natural Resources, but there was no one inside it. And then, from the dark tree line behind the empty coat, I saw movement. Not a distinct shape, but a shifting of the darkness itself. The shadows between the trees seemed to detach themselves, flowing outward like spilled ink. The silence broke. A sound rolled across the tundra, coming from the trees. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a growl. It was the sound of mimicry. "Hey," the voice called back. It was my voice. "Hey, over here." It was a perfect recording, played back at high volume, but with that same underlying rasp I had heard on the radio. The sound of dry leaves on concrete. "Im the lookout." The voice screamed from the trees. I lowered the rifle. I didn't think. I turned and ran. I ran through the deep snow, my lungs burning in the freezing air, my legs churning through the drifts. I didn't look back. I could hear the sound of the silence rushing in behind me, a vacuum trying to suck me back. I reached the tower base, scrambling up the ladder, slipping, banging my knees, hauling myself up by sheer adrenaline. I threw myself over the railing, crawled to the door, and slammed it shut, spinning the locking wheel until it wouldn't turn anymore. I collapsed on the floor, gasping, staring at the ceiling. It had my voice. It had been listening. It had been recording. And now, it was calling me back. I spent the next hour curled in a ball underneath the heavy oak desk. The rifle clutched so tightly against my chest that the metal receiver left a bruise on my sternum. My mind was a broken record, looping that sound over and over again, my own voice. Hey, over here. It wasn't just a recording. A recording has static. It has a flatness to it. That voice had been wet. It had been pushed through a throat that was lined with mucus and cartilage, shaped by a tongue that was too thick for the words. It was a biological approximation of me. The silence outside had returned, but it was no longer passive. It felt heavy, expectant. The cabin, which had withstood blizzards that buried the catwalks and winds that stripped paint, felt flimsy. I looked at the steel door. It was locked, dead-bolted, and barricaded with a chair. But I had seen the handprint. I knew how long those fingers were. I knew that steel was just soft clay to something with that kind of leverage. I couldn't stay here, but I couldn't leave. The yellow parka, the empty yellow parka. If that had been a rescue attempt, it was gone. If it was a lure, it was waiting. Think, I hissed, striking my forehead with the heel of my palm. Think, Finn. You're a lookout. You observe. You signal. Signal, the radio was dead. The phone was dead. My voice was compromised. It had been stolen. But light was pure. Light was physics. I crawled out from under the desk. The gray twilight outside hadn't shifted. It was a stagnant ocean. If I couldn't scream for help, I would have to burn a hole in the sky. I went to the emergency locker. It was a red metal box welded to the floor near the bunk. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers numb and clumsy, until it popped open. Inside lay the catastrophic gear, the stuff you only touch when the world has gone to hell. Medical kits, emergency rations, bare mace, and the flares. There was a plastic case containing 12 road flares, the high-intensity magnesium kind that burn at 1,600 degrees Celsius. Beside them lay the flare gun, a chunky orange pistol with a single chamber, and a box of aerial shells. I grabbed them all. My plan was manic, born of a desperate need to do something, anything, other than wait for the door to be peeled open. I would turn the tower into a lighthouse. I would create a beacon so bright that it would be impossible to ignore. If there was a satellite passing overhead, if there was a plane flying blind in the upper atmosphere, if there was a god looking down at this forsaken patch of ice, they would see me. I grabbed a roll of duct tape and the jerry can of kerosene I used for the lamps. I moved to the center of the room. I taped 4 of the road flares together into a bundle. Then I taped 4 more. I soaked a rag in kerosene and wrapped it around the base of the bundles. It was a crude, dangerous incendiary device. I looked at the window. I couldn't open it. I wouldn't open it. I would have to go out to the catwalk one last time. The thought made my bowels turn to water, but the alternative was sitting in the dark until the thing with 7 fingers decided to come in. I suited up. I didn't bother with the full layers this time. I just threw on the parka and the gloves. I wasn't planning on being out there long enough to freeze. I loaded the flare gun. I tucked the flare bundles into my pockets. I grabbed the lighter. 1 minute, I whispered. Out, light, shoot in. I moved the chair. I slid the deadbolt. I took a breath that tasted of copper and fear. I threw the door open and stepped out. The silence was waiting for me. It rushed into the open door, swirling around my legs. I didn't look at the ladder. I didn't look at the tree line. I kept my eyes fixed on the railing facing south, toward the base, toward civilization. I ran to the railing. I pulled the first bundle of flares from my pocket. I struck the igniter cap. Hiss! The magnesium caught instantly, blooming into a blinding, brilliant red phosphorescence. The light was searing, painful after weeks of gray gloom. It cast wild, jagged shadows against the tower walls. I threw the bundle over the railing, aiming for the snowpack below. It hissed through the air and landed with a thump, sizzling as it melted a crater into the ice. A pool of blood-red light began to spread across the ground. I lit the second bundle. Hiss. I threw it to the east. The world around the tower was suddenly bathed in a violent, flickering crimson. The gray twilight was pushed back, retreating into a hard black edge where the light failed to reach. I raised the flare gun. I pointed it straight up into the matte, featureless void of the sky. See me, I screamed. I pulled the trigger. Thump. Whoosh. The recoil kicked against my palm. A streak of white fire tore upward. climbing hundreds of feet in a second. It reached its apex and popped. A parachute deployed, and a brilliant white star began to drift slowly down, bathing the entire valley in a harsh, stark illumination. For a moment I felt triumph. I had broken the gray. I had made a mark. And then I looked at the horizon. The white light of the aerial flare pushed the visibility out for miles. It illuminated the ridges, the frozen creek beds, the vast expanse of the tundra. And it illuminated the mountains. Only, the mountains had moved. To the west, where the jagged peaks of the Endicott Range should have been, there was a wall. A smooth, vertical wall of absolute blackness that stretched from the ground up into the infinite sky. It wasn't rock. It wasn't cloud. It was a substance. It absorbed the light of the flare. The white brilliance hit that wall and simply vanished, extinguished like a candle in a vacuum. And as the flare drifted lower, the wall shifted. It rippled. My mouth fell open, the scream dying in my throat. It wasn't a mountain range. It was a limb. Something vast, something so impossibly, gargantuanly large, that my brain refused to process the scale was standing on the horizon. The mountains were just the edges of its form. It blocked out the west. It blocked out the sun. The darkness wasn't atmospheric. The darkness was it, and the light had caught its attention. The ripple in the black wall accelerated. A section of the darkness detached itself from the main mass, moving with terrifying speed across the tundra toward the tower. It flowed over the ground like a landslide of oil, swallowing the snow, swallowing the trees. The red flares burning on the ground below me suddenly seemed pathetic. Tiny sparks against a coming tidal wave. I heard a sound then, a sound that dwarfed the mimicry in the woods. It was a deep, resonant thrumming, the sound of the planet itself groaning under a tremendous weight. Thrum thrum. The tower shook. The bolts rattled in the steel. I scrambled backward, fumbling with the door handle. The flare overhead flickered and died, plunging the world back into the red glow of the ground flares. But the red light was shrinking. I looked over the railing one last time. The flares I had thrown burning at 1,600 degrees were dimming. Something was gathering around them. Shadows. Not cast shadows, but physical things. Long, spindly, seven-fingered shadows were reaching out of the gloom, circling the burning magnesium. They didn't burn. They didn't recoil. They were eating the light. I saw a hand black, translucent, and oily reach into the core of the burning flare. It cupped the flame, and the flame went out. Total darkness rushed back in on that side of the tower. "No," I whimpered. I threw myself inside the cabin and slammed the door, locking it, bolting it, jamming the chair back under the handle. I backed away until I hit the far wall. The light from the second flare bundle on the east side was fading now, too. I could see the red glow dimming through the frosted window. Click. The sound came from the window. I looked up. The wire I had taped to the glass was vibrating violently. Click, 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 and then a face pressed against the glass. It was illuminated by the dying embers of the flare below. It was pale. Human, it had blue eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. It was Elias, my supervisor. He was smiling. A wide, pleasant smile. "Finn," Elias said. His voice didn't come from the radio. It came through the glass, muffled but audible. "Finn, open the door." "The supply drop is here," I stared at him. Elias was 70 miles away. Elias was human. The thing at the window blinked, but the eyelids didn't close top to bottom. They closed side to side, nictitating membranes. "It's sunny out here, Finn," the thing that looked like Elias said. Its smile stretching wider, too wide. The corners of its mouth reaching its ears. "Look at the sun. It's so bright." The red light outside died completely. The flare was gone. The face at the window was now just a pale smear in the gray twilight. "Let the light in, Finn," it whispered, its voice changing, dropping that octave into the dry leaf rasp. "We are so hungry for the light." I raised the flare gun. I had one shell left in the chamber. "Get away," I screamed. "Open." The voice rasped, vibrating the glass. I pulled the trigger. The flare gun didn't fire into the sky this time. It fired point blank into the reinforced glass of the cupola window. Boom! The glass shattered outward. The white phosphorus shell hit the face of the thing that looked like Elias. It didn't scream. It shrieked a sound of tearing metal, and bending reality. The magnesium ignited on its skin, burning with blinding white fury. The creature fell backward off the catwalk, flailing into the dark. But the hole in the window remained. The cold air rushed in, the silence rushed in, and through the jagged teeth of the broken glass, I saw the sky. The vast black wall I had seen on the horizon was no longer on the horizon. It was directly overhead. The sky blinked. An eye the size of a city opened in the zenith of the heavens. It looked down at the tower. It looked down at me. And the darkness began to pour in. The cold that entered the cabin wasn't atmospheric. It was the temperature of deep space, a vacuum chill that instantly crystallized the sweat on my forehead and turned the air in my lungs to jagged shards of glass. The hole in the window, jagged and weeping shards of reinforced glass, was a mouth, and the mouth was swallowing my sanctuary. I dropped the flare gun. It clattered on the floorboards, a hollow, useless sound. I scrambled backward, crab walking until my spine hit the metal legs of the cot. I pulled the heavy wool blanket down, wrapping it around myself. Not for warmth, nothing could keep out this cold, but for the pathetic, childish need to hide. Outside, the burning body of the thing that looked like Elias had vanished into the abyss below. The red flares I had thrown were gone, extinguished. The only light remaining in the universe was the sputtering blue flame of the propane stove, and the terrified erratic beam of my maglite, which rolled across the floor where I had dropped it. And the eye. The aperture in the sky above didn't close. It rotated. The sheer scale of it induced a sense of vertigo that made me retch. It wasn't an eye of flesh and fluid. It was a swirling vortex of collapsing starlight. A pupil made of event horizons. It watched the tower with a detached, clinical curiosity. The darkness poured through the broken window. It didn't rush in like wind. It slithered. Thick, viscous tendrils of shadow, darker than the gloom of the room, flowed over the sill and dripped onto the floor. They pooled like spilled ink, spreading outward, seeking. They were seeking the light. I watched, paralyzed, as a tendril of darkness moved toward the maglite. It didn't block the beam, it drank it. As the shadow touched the lens, the light didn't reflect. It was absorbed, the beam shortened, dimmed, and then was snuffed out completely. Leaving the flashlight dead, the darkness grew. It pulsed. It moved toward the stove. "No," I whispered. My voice was barely a breath. The blue flame was my only heat. If that went out, the physics of the Arctic would kill me in minutes. The shadow circled the stove, rising up like cobras swaying to a charmer's flute. They hesitated. They seemed to be savoring the energy, the heat, the photon emission. And then the realization hit me. It hit me harder than the cold, harder than the fear. It wasn't attacking, it was feeding the flares. The sun, the stars, the radio waves. It consumed energy, it consumed radiation. It was an entropy engine, a cosmic parasite that had latched onto this part of the world to drain it dry. And I was a battery. I was 98.6 degrees of biological heat. I was a chemical engine of synapses and electrical impulses. I was a beacon of consciousness in a dead world. The eye in the sky shifted. The pressure in the room increased. The mimic in the woods, the one that stole my voice, it hadn't been trying to trick me into opening the door to kill me. It wanted me to open the door so the darkness could get in. The glass had been the only thing filtering the consumption. Now, the seal was broken. I looked at the propane stove. The shadows were inching closer to the flame. If I let them take the heat, I died. If I fought them, I died. But there was a third option. I reached out a trembling hand. My fingers were blue, stiff. I grabbed the knob of the stove. I didn't turn it up. I turned it off. Click, the hiss of the gas stopped. The blue flame flickered once, gasped and died. Total darkness. The cabin was plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness. The only thing visible was the faint, impossible luminescence of the eye through the broken window. A swirling purple nebula that offered no illumination, only observation. The tendrils of shadow stopped. They hovered in the dark, confused. Without the concentrated source of the flame, they had nothing to latch onto. I held my breath. I slowed my heart rate, forcing my body into a state of near hibernation. I became a stone. I became a part of the cold. The silence stretched. Seconds became minutes. Minutes became hours. The shadows retreated. They flowed back out the window, merging with the greater darkness outside. They were searching for brighter fires. I sat there in the dark, freezing alive. It has been... I don't know how long. Time doesn't exist here anymore. I eventually found the strength to move. I fumbled in the dark and found the roll of duct tape and a tarp. I sealed the window. It's a flimsy barrier, but it keeps the physical substance of the shadows out. It keeps the heat of my body, what little is left in. I live in the dark now. I don't turn on the lamps. I don't use the flashlight. I eat my cold beans in the blackness. I drink the slushy water from the reserve tank. I learned that if I create a spark, if I light a match, the scratching starts at the tarp immediately. They are always outside, waiting for a photon, waiting for a crumb of light. The cold is constant, but I've adapted. Or maybe I've changed. My skin feels different, harder, colder. My eyes have adjusted to a spectrum I didn't know existed. I can see shapes in the room now, outlines of heat and entropy. The radio still works, but only one way. I fixed it in the dark, working by touch. I didn't turn the receiver on. I don't want to hear the whispers. I don't want to hear the stolen voices of Elias or Gwen or my own echoes. But I can broadcast. I rigged the transmitter to low power, a trickle of energy. Just enough to send a signal out, but not enough to attract the eye. I don't know if anyone can hear me. I don't know if the darkness has spread beyond the Brooks Range. Maybe Fairbanks is gone. Maybe Anchorage is dark. Maybe the whole world has been swallowed by the twilight. But if you are hearing this, if you are seeing the static on your screen or hearing the crackle in your speakers, listen to me. Look at the sky. Does it look a little darker today? Does the sun feel a little colder? Do the shadows in the corner of your room seem to linger a little longer than they should? Don't ignore it. And whatever you do, do not light a signal fire. Do not try to fight the dark with light. You are just feeding it. You are just showing it where you are. The only way to survive is to become quiet, to become cold, to let the fire go out. I am Firewatch 4, but am not watching for fires anymore. I'm watching the things that eat them. I am the silent observer, and I am signing off. If you can hear this broadcast, you are the resistance. You are the light that they haven't found yet. Keep it hidden. Keep it safe. But I need to know, has the sky turned gray where you are? Tell me in the comments below. Describe the sky. I need to map the spread of the darkness. And if you want to help this signal reach the survivors before the grid goes down, click the like button. Share this transmission. Subscribe to the frequency so you don't miss the next warning. Stay in the dark. Stay alive.